Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blanks and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Hello, and thank you for tuning into the GSMC television podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Chad, and I am very excited today because today we are going to talk about one of my favorite shows and franchises on television, The Bachelor. For those of you who are not aware, The Bachelor finale happened last week. As well as the After the Final Rose episode, which is a show that they do after the final rose of the season's been handed out, where they bring back the top three contestants usually and the Bachelor, and they get to kind of work through any residual or remaining questions, and it's always a live show with an audience, and so at the end they usually will announce who the next Bachelorette or Bachelor is going to be, depending on what season they're in, and so it's an exciting time for anyone who is a fan of The Bachelor and all the Bachelor Nation shows in that franchise, and so I'm super excited to be talking about it with you today. And then at the end of the show, I'm going to end it with a segment I'm wanting to start, so this will be the first time I've ever done it, called Interesting Things I Learned About TV This Week. And we're going to be talking about an article I read about Channel 37. And why a lot of people's televisions don't have a Channel 37, and how that connects to aliens. So right there, you got to stick around to the end, because who doesn't want to know how Channel 37 connects to aliens? All right. So yeah, we got a kind of a loaded show here today, talking about 2 episodes of The Bachelor. I want to start by saying that there will be spoilers in this podcast. So right off the top, please know I'm talking about The Bachelor. I'm talking about the results. There will be spoilers. If you haven't seen it yet and you want to watch, I recommend just pressing pause, go watch the episode, and then come back and rejoin the podcast here, because I don't want to spoil it for anyone. And if you really don't care, or it's already been spoiled by the 9,000 things that are out on the internet, in terms of articles and posts and blogs and whatnot, then sit right where you are and let's jump right in. The other piece that I want to mention is during this season, there was a controversy, which I'll briefly recap kind of what that controversy was here in a moment, because it will connect to the After the Final Rose portion of our discussion today. I am going to do my level best to stay away from my personal opinions when it comes to the controversy and those involved, and really just kind of present what it is and how the franchise itself has handled the controversy. I'm doing that for a number of reasons. I encourage you, if you are curious and want to learn more, there's been several really great articles written about it. Rachel Lindsay, former Bachelorette, has a podcast, Bachelor Happy Hour, where it's been addressed. So feel free to dig a little deeper, form your own opinions, but I'm going to intentionally not kind of infuse this conversation with a bunch of my own personal thoughts as best that I can. But it still should be a fun and intriguing conversation. So, I'm going to start with recapping the final episode. So in my Critics' Choice podcast on Sunday, I talked about the Fantasy Suites episode of The Bachelor, where the final 3 women get to spend the night with The Bachelor without the cameras and stuff, so that they can have deeper conversation and so on. So we are now down to the final 2 at the start of this finale episode. The final 2 being Michelle and Rachel. Michelle, for those of you that don't know, is my personal fave and my front runner at this point, as I turned on my television and I had her. I had to make a choice in my fantasy league bracket whether I was going to go with Michelle, my personal favorite, or if I was going to go with Rachel. And I may or may not have chosen Michelle. I'm kidding. I didn't choose Michelle. I picked Rachel because I had saw a spoiler and I wanted to win my fantasy league. So, but I digress. So we start the episode. We're down to the final 2 contestants, Rachel and Michelle. And the way the finale usually works is there is a date with each of the women, and as part of that date, they get to meet the suitor's family. So in this case, they would get to meet Matt's family. The people that were there from Matt's side to meet with the young ladies this season are his mother and his brother. And so he starts the episode with Michelle. So he takes Michelle out on a date. This date was kind of interesting to me as a longtime watcher of the show. So they got together, and he kind of does this, close your eyes, even though they're walking up multiple flights of stairs thing. And they go to the roof of the resort where they're staying, and he kind of takes her to the edge and tells her to open her eyes, and he points down at what looks like a landing strip. I don't know if it was like a landing strip, because why would there be a landing strip right next to the hotel? Or a parking lot. But he points to this couch that's in this giant heart, and you can see the flowers and a little table and champagne and all that down there. And he kind of says, that's where we need to go. We got to get down there. And she's like, okay. And he's like, but we're not going to take the stairs. And so they look over the edge, and you see there's rappelling ropes, and now there's a guy with, all the harnesses and stuff, and they're going to get to the couch by rappelling down the side of the building. Now, they've done rappelling dates on this show before. It tends to happen earlier on in the season when he's got multiple women that he's dating, and he's trying to kind of see who he's got the connection with, and it almost always is used as a way to kind of create that bonding through a shared fear, and it's an opportunity for the guy to support his woman and vice versa. And so the fact that they were doing this now, it's literally the last date before he decides if he's going to marry this woman or not, or propose rather, seemed a little off to me. At this point, they've had multiple dates. They've spent the night together. I wasn't really clear what the intention of this trust exercise was, other than the fact that they're quarantined on a resort and maybe ran out of, COVID-safe activities. And so someone was like, I know, let's just have them rappel down the building. So they did that. Now, don't get me wrong. The fact that I was like a little confused that this activity was happening at this point in the process does not negate the fact that it was hilarious to watch. Especially since Matt was so clunky in trying to do it. Now, I laugh. I would never rappel down the side of a building. I'm afraid of heights, not my jam. Even if I was on this show, I think that would be like my worst nightmare date that I may or may not opt to participate in. So he tries to kind of get started. They got their harnesses on, they're at the edge of the building, and instead of kind of stepping back, he just kind of tipped his body back as though he was scuba diving, like you would off the side of the boat. And that apparently, in rappelling, not the thing to do. So there was kind of this tense moment as you wonder if he's going to, have a really big problem. And and their like instructor or the person that helped to get him in the harness is like, whoa, like he wasn't supposed to go kind of thing. And so they talk him back to his kind of foot stance. So he's got his feet on the side of the building. And then it's Michelle's turn to kind of take that plunge over the precipice of this, multi-story building. And she does it with the grace of like a mountain goat. Like it's as though she had done it before and does it every other weekend because she just finds it fun. And this kind of juxtaposition continued. And it actually ended up being kind of an interesting dynamic to watch because Matt is trying to support and coach and help Michelle down the building, but keeps kind of getting himself into these little binds where she's ending up having to actually help him. And so it had its kind of usual result of the two of them really working together to tackle this thing. But in terms of if you were giving ratings for who looked most comfortable and rocked it, Michelle definitely would take the medal on that one. So they get down and they go and they sit down on the couch and they're kind of talking. And Matt has shared with us through his kind of talking to the camera moment that he's got reservations. He's really struggling with this decision. And he needs to have a conversation with Michelle, and he's not feeling comfortable with having that conversation. And so Michelle actually kind of opens up. They've spent a lot of time together, and she seems to be pretty intuitive in terms of how he is or what he's going through. And so she kind of asks him a question while they're camping out on the couch to try to get to something that she's been kind of picking up on, which is this, need to understand, is he ready? Like, is he truly ready for what's coming in this week where he's supposed to make a choice between these two women and propose? And Matt kind of brushes over that. He doesn't really answer the question. He gives her an answer. And he talks about, the conversation with his dad and how he's not like him. And, so we kind of get this rehash of what he had said before, but he doesn't actually get down to the nitty gritty. Let me open up and let you know that I'm struggling. And so the conversation ends and they have to go off to meet his family. And so they leave the couch and they go to this, suite or room, and they go to meet his mom and his brother. And let me tell you, this meeting goes so well. Like, if you are in a relationship and you have to meet the significant other's family, oh my Lord, you want it to go this good. It was so comfortable. Very much like we saw when Matt met Michelle's family. The conversation was smooth. The brothers kind of talking to Michelle and grilling her and kind of trying to throw these questions in as though they're going to stump her, or she may answer in a way that, he finds fault with. And no, she like just flying colors. And it seems very natural, like they've been family, quote unquote, for years. And so Matt, they finish the meeting, and Matt gets up and walks Michelle out and everything, and they're sharing with each other just how well that went and how happy they are, and he's super happy. And you can tell that any kind of reservations or concerns that he had before the date and during the date seem to have melted away now that she's actually met his family and has been able to see kind of that dynamic and feel that dynamic for himself. So Michelle leaves, as they do, and he goes back in to kind of have a follow-up conversation with his family to see, what did they think, how did they feel about the meeting. And they kind of echo what I was picking up, what Matt was sharing with us is, like, wow, she's a great, great girl. And they can tell that they have a great connection and all of these things. But something happens. And I don't know if it is just a genuine parental kind of motherly concern, or if it's kind of a residual impact on the mother and the brother to how the family dynamic of his father leaving impacted all of them. But his mother begins to kind of express some caution, this kind of, it's great now, but, is it going to always be this way? Are you really in love? Do you make the decision, because that honeymoon feeling goes away kind of conversation. And the brother is kind of supportive of this. And so it starts with his mom making these comments, and then the brother kind of supports it, and then the mom makes a final comment around, this idea that you've got these feelings now, but what if they don't last? And you can see all over Matt's face this giant, like, oh, poop moment where he is just thrown back into turmoil. And that's reinforced when the camera comes back to him and he starts talking about how he doesn't know anymore. He was so sure. And he kind of doing his one-on-one personal interview, letting the audience in on his thoughts. And he shares that he needs to have a conversation with Michelle. And I'm thinking at this point that that's a good thing. Michelle had asked him how he was doing. He kind of brushed over that. This meeting went really good, but now he's kind of having these thoughts, these concerns again. It would be really good for him to share that with Michelle. Because Michelle, one of the things I love about her is I think she would have been able to be a good partner with him through that process of working through these kind of insecurities, this self-doubt that he's going through. Not in a way that says, I'm going to try to persuade you to choose me or do something you're not ready for, but in just a natural, caring, almost like an educator would to a student. She's a teacher, so that kind of makes sense. But that kind of way. And so they go to commercial, which is what we're going to do right now. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, I'm going to pick up on Matt's conversation with Michelle, and then we'll continue on the discussion of the finale episode of The Bachelor. Don't forget, we are going to talk about After the Final Rose, and we are going to end the show today with a new segment I'm starting called Things I Learned About Television This Week. So stay tuned.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. Keith keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
All right, welcome back to the GSMC television podcast with your host, Chad. We are talking about all things Bachelor today, and I'm about to jump back into my recap of the finale. Before the break, we were talking about Matt's final date with Michelle, where she got to meet his mom and his brother, and how following that meeting that went really, really well, he's racked once again with doubt after something that his mother said to him. And so he decides he has to talk to Michelle. So he goes to meet Michelle for the evening portion of the date, and it's clear that she knows he's coming. We see her lighting candles. She's got some little schmeckens or something on the table, and some glasses of wine. And he comes into the room, and she greets him warmly. They say hello. They sit down, and it's interesting because he knows that he has this thing that he wants to talk about, but he doesn't jump into it. Instead, actually, it's Michelle that kind of starts the conversation. And at this point, she's sharing with him how wonderful the day was, how much she loved meeting his family, how comfortable she felt. She's making comparisons to when he met her family and how well that went. And she presents him with a gift. And she hands him this bag. And he opens it up, and it's like a basketball jersey, and it's got his name on it, Mr. James, on the back, and she then says, "But that's not all." And she goes and she gets this other bag, and he opens the other bag, and it's another jersey. Only this one says Miss James on the back because it's her jersey. And she acknowledges that it's a little bit, presumptuous, but she really feels like this is right. She's really connecting with him. And she feels like that together they can kind of conquer the world and handle anything. And so she even named their team something like Worry-Free World Warriors or something like that. It was like the triple W's. And it just really, really, really was a nice gesture that showed him just how into him and how into this relationship she was. It's also unfortunate because he follows that up by telling her about his doubts. And this conversation took a turn that had me screaming at my cell phone, because that's how I was watching it, was on my phone. And he basically shares his concerns and shares his doubts and shares the fact that he really, really cares for her deeply, but that he can't move forward with this relationship, and legit just breaks up with her. Now, there is a process, people. This show has been on the air for 25 seasons. Let me tell you, there is a way this is supposed to work when you get to the last two people. You have your two dates, and then they get all dressed up in fancy dresses, and they go to a weird spot somewhere, and they stand there, and they wait for you to come and say something nice, and that something nice either ends with a proposal or a breakup. And we, as the audience, is used to that structure. So when all of a sudden he's ending the relationship in a hotel room, he hasn't even had his date with Rachel yet, I'm like, holy moly, what is happening? And you gotta feel bad for the girl who just went and made jerseys and named the team, and you just knew she had a kid one on ready to order, for when the first child came. It was really, really difficult to watch. It was very difficult to watch. If for no other reason, I think Michelle was just as shell-shocked as I was as a viewer that this went down this way. Because there really wasn't, in my mind, anything that happened before between the two of them that could have set that up, other than this thing that his mother said that got him all crazy in the brain. So he leaves. He leaves, and Michelle is left there, broke up, and we just don't see Michelle anymore for like the rest of the episode. But what we do see is Matt in like a constant state of turmoil. This man is melting down. You want to talk about issues. I've not seen anyone have as hard a struggle at this point in the game as Matt is having right now. And so it was really, really challenging to watch, but also, I found myself really struggling with being able to be on his side, because I feel like part of what he was struggling with was the process, right? And I feel like when you sign up to do the show that it ends with a proposal. So if you have that big of a issue with commitment, you would think you just wouldn't do the show. But I also, continue to remind myself that he tried to work through that. All those pieces throughout the season, and in that last episode with his dad and the young women. So, I try to give him kind of the benefit of the doubt. But he's struggling a lot. He's struggling so much so that he is supposed to go on a date with Rachel. And he instead meets with Chris Harrison, the host of the show, and he's talking with Chris about what's going on for him, and they have a very candid sit down, and Chris starts asking him some really hard questions, and some of those questions are questions of clarification, and one of the ones he says is, where do we go from here? Do you see yourself proposing to someone at the end of this? And Matt says no. And leaves it in their conversation open as though he actually might not choose anyone. And so Chris's response is kind of like, okay. Glad we had this talk kind of thing. And it's as though he had to leave to go talk with the producers to figure out, what are we going to do? Because, the show is literally kind of morphing in front of us. And so Matt decides that he needs time to work through this. And he apparently needs so much time that Chris Harrison goes to Rachel on the morning of their date and shares with Rachel that the date's been called off, that Matt is struggling, and there would not be a date. And that the next time she sees him will likely be at the final rose ceremony. Now, understand that Rachel does not know that Michelle is gone. So all she knows is She's not going to get to see Matt. She's not going to meet his family. And she's not going to know where he's at, how he feels about her, potentially until she's standing in that spot waiting to see if she gets a ring or sent home at the end. And so she, of course, is struggling with that. And you cannot blame her. I mean, I would be too. And the way this is, I mean, she's, they're by themselves. They're kind of secluded. They don't have cell phones. It's not like you can just call somebody. Like, she's just kind of sitting, stewing, thinking, marinating on all of this doubt and questions. And that had to be horrible for her. Meanwhile, Matt is continuing to work through, in his mind, whatever he's working through. And we see that he decides to move forward with choosing a ring. So the last episode, Neil Lane, kind of the official jeweler of the Bachelor franchise, shows up with rings, and then he sits down and he works through with the Bachelors how, the process of picking a ring for their prospective loved one. And Matt decides to go through with that, even though he doesn't even know if he's going to propose at the end of this, if he's going to need the ring. He still goes through this process. And part of the reason he says he's going to go through it is he's hoping that it will help him to find some clarity. And so Neil Lane has presented him with 5 different rings. And he kind of recommends to him this pear-shaped ring, which Neil says is his personal favorite cut of diamond. And Matt agrees. He really likes the pear shape, so he decides to go with that. So he says goodbye and thanks to Neil. Neil goes off, and we see Matt standing kind of out on a balcony. And he's got the ring in his hand, and he's continuing kind of this monologue. This monologue for us out loud that, he's still trying to decide what he's going to do. He's not really sure. He was hoping the ring would help him get some clarity, but he's just not ready. He just doesn't know if he can get there. And so then we see what I find was the comic relief moment of the episode, where he closes the box and goes to stick it into the pocket of his skinny jeans. There's no way that box was fitting in the pocket of his skinny jeans, and so I personally got a chuckle before they cut to commercial at that little detail, that little tidbit. So then he comes back. We come back from the commercial break, and Matt is getting ready. Rachel's getting ready for this kind of final moment, and he's goes to the lake, this kind of wooded area by the lake, and he meets with Chris Harrison, and he basically, lets Chris know that he knows what he wants to do. He wants to be in a relationship with Rachel, but that he is not going to propose. That he just can't propose. And so Chris accepts that and wishes them good luck, and he goes off to another spot near the lake where they've set up this, it almost looks like a cabin. There's like a fireplace and all these kind of wood accents, but it has no walls. So it's just kind of this gazebo that was dressed to look like a cabin. And the final rose presentation kind of backgrounds and settings are always kind of interesting, sometimes done better than others. This one, I wondered if it was intentionally symbolic, I'm living in this facade of a house called love, and not really willing to commit, so we haven't put the walls up yet, kind of thing. It's just kind of an interesting look. But Rachel arrives, and she still does not know what is going on. And so she goes to meet him, and they're standing together and they're holding hands, and she speaks first, and she shares with him that she was very concerned, that, he canceled their date and didn't get to see him, and that it, was impactful for her, and it impacted her because she loves him and hopes he's okay, and that whether he chooses her or not, she loves him. And so if he's hurting, it hurts her. It was a very, very wonderful, wonderful speech. And Matt responds, and he responds in a very positive way. He clearly has had time to kind of think through his thoughts. He's clearly resolved in the decision that he's made, and he's comfortable with the decision he's made not to move forward with the proposal. And so he basically just tells her, look, I'm here with you. I'm in it. But I can't propose to you today. But that he wants to leave this space, this show, in a committed relationship, committed to her. And then, whatever happens after that happens, kind of thing. And she agrees. She agrees to those terms. And so it's really interesting because it was not like any of the finales I think I've seen before. This one, there's, like I said, I've seen people have cold feet, not really know what to do, in love with multiple people, having a hard time with the choice, but never quite the way this went down. And never in a situation where the last person didn't get their final date, didn't get to meet the family. Like, that was a really big shift and departure from the kind of formulaic process of the show. And so the fact that she was so open, I think one spoke, volumes about Rachel and her kind of commitment or love for Matt. And I thought it was good that Matt seemed to kind of reach a resolution to a monumental problem that he was having in trying to balance the formula and process of the show, The Bachelor, with what was a very real challenge for him personally in this relationship as far as kind of moving to that next step. So overall, good finale. Really enjoyed it. Still feel really bad for Michelle. But super glad I picked Rachel in my fantasy league because I did win by 23 points. I took first in my league, so that's pretty awesome. I had a friend of mine that was breathing down my neck all season. It was so close. So yeah. All right, guys, we are going to take another break. When we get back, we are going to talk about the show After the Final Rose. We're going to talk a little bit about the controversy that happened off camera this season and how the show handled it in their After the Final Rose episode. And please stick around because we're going to end the show with a new segment called Things I Learned About TV This Week. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Television Podcast with your host, Chad. We are talking about The Bachelor today and all things Bachelor. In the first half of our show, I talked about the Bachelor finale. And now we're going to talk about After the Final Rose. So for those of you that don't watch the show, at the end of the season, after the finale, there's always one last show called After the Final Rose. It's kind of the season look-back episode, the chance to tie up loose ends. Inevitably, the person who doesn't get chosen has feelings, thoughts, ideas that they would like to express with The Bachelor. And prior to this show, as far as we, the audience, know, they don't really have communication. And so this is a really great opportunity for two people who were in a relationship, a very intense kind of experience together, to get closure. And so it's a really, usually a pretty interesting episode. Normally done in front of a live studio audience, and almost always where they kind of present to the world who the next bachelor or bachelorette will be, depending on where they're at in the process. And in some cases, past contestants have actually gotten to meet some of the people that they'll be dating in the After the Final Rose episode. And so this one was a little bit different for a number of reasons. So first, you have COVID and the fact that COVID protocols prevented them from doing their usual live studio audience. And so After the Final Rose took place in a studio setting with no audience. The second thing that was different was that the After the Final Rose was not hosted by the host of the show, Chris Harrison. Instead, there was a gentleman by the name of Emmanuel Acho that stepped in to host this final episode of the season. So why was there a substitute host? So during the season, as we were watching it as viewers, a controversy kind of erupted online involving Rachel Kirkconnell, who was ultimately the winner of the episode, or the season, rather. She's the one that he picked to continue his relationship with. The issue that arose were some pictures that had been posted to social media several years before, 2018 to be exact, showing her at a antebellum-themed party, as well as one other photo of questionable kind of morals. And so the kind of result was kind of a slow bubble on social media, and it kind of all came to a head when Chris Harrison went on E! News with Rachel Lindsay, former Bachelorette, the first ever Black Bachelorette in the franchise history, who now has a very successful podcasts and is a personality for E! News. And she asked him some very direct questions about this controversy that was brewing, and he responded in a way that was exhibited privilege and very kind of tone deaf, and didn't really create any opportunity for Rachel to speak and reference kind of cancel culture and woke police and all these other things that just were not the best response or reaction during this interview. And so the result was multiple calls for his resignation and or firing. Chris did apologize. Rachel Kirkconnell has since apologized, and Matt James, the Bachelor, has also made a statement over via social media about the overall controversy of these racially insensitive photos. And so what was decided and announced was that Chris Harrison would take a step back from the franchise to become more educated around race, and that he would not participate in the After the Final Rose episode. He was in all of the episodes of the regular season, which had all been recorded prior to this all happening, but he was not, as he traditionally would be, the host of the After the Final Rose. So what was done is they looked for who would host this episode, is they brought in Emmanuel Acho. And Emmanuel Acho, for those of you who are not familiar with him, he is a former NFL football player, linebacker to be specific. He played for the Browns as well as the Philadelphia Eagles between 2012 and 2015. He then went on to work with ESPN and is now with Fox Sports 1 and co-hosts a show called Speak for Yourself. He has recently started his own weekly YouTube series as recent as last summer called Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man, in which he has guests that come in and he works to create a safe place for uncomfortable conversations about race that many people have never been able to have. He tries to create that space so that people can have that conversation with him as a way to provide a free space. This is his quote. He wanted to remove barriers for why we've never had these conversations, and I want to provide a free space for curious white people to answer the questions they've always had but have been too nervous to ask. So again, that's Emmanuel Acho's quote on why he created this series. He's had a lot of guests, Matthew McConaughey, Roger Goodell, Chelsea Handler, Chip and Joanna Gaines, a number of them. And his series is extremely popular and was turned into a book of the same name, November of last year. And it's now being turned into a children's book called Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Boy. He I got to know who he was when I was watching Conversations with Oprah, I believe is the name of the series, on Apple TV Plus. He was actually one of her first guests, and I found the conversation that they had to be absolutely phenomenal. He has just a wonderful way of coming alongside people and creating exactly this space for them to have a difficult conversation about race, and do it in a way that is non-judgmental, and just, I think, is really, really wonderfully helpful, especially given the world in which we live and the things that have been happening. And so when I heard that he was being brought in, I thought that was a wonderful, wonderful decision. And so I eagerly turned on the episode. And right off the bat, I would just like to share that I found the way this episode was done to be a little bit challenging as a viewer of the show for a long time. And here's why. The show has these two competing kind of problems now. The problem of, as a franchise, viewers expect a certain conversation to happen during the final, after the Final Rose episode, where these individuals are able to kind of get their closure for these relationships. And that's the one hand. On the other hand, they now have this very serious controversy that needs to be addressed. One so serious that the one and only host of the franchise has now stepped away. So it has to be addressed. And so I was interested to see how they were going to meet kind of both things. And so the way it was approached was Emmanuel came out and he hosted. And he shared with the audience why he was there. He shared with the audience the intention of the evening, which is to, kind of wrap up the show, but also to talk about this larger controversy. And to check in with Matt and Rachel to see where they're at in their relationship, having just endured several weeks of this in real time. And so the first guest that comes out to the hot seat, as they call it, it's the couch where people sit and talk with the host, is Michelle. Michelle looks fabulous. And she comes out and she sits down with him and they start to talk about the relationship that she had with Matt and how she's feeling with the way the show ended. And so she shares with Emmanuel that she's struggling. She's not in a good place because she was blindsided by what happened. And she apparently, behind the scenes, had asked the producers to speak with Matt. Not to try to change his mind, but to try to get closure. Because she was left just, so many unanswered questions and just kind of out of the blue, shell-shocked by his decision to break up with her in that moment. And so, as we learn from this conversation, she asked for this opportunity. The producers presented that question, that ask, to Matt, and Matt declined to meet with her. So she's upset, and she is about to have to sit and talk with Matt directly, one-on-one, for the first time since that evening. And so I, as a fan of Michelle, I really felt for her in this moment. And this is where Emmanuel kind of says, okay, I'm sorry to hear that you are going through that, and you're going to get a chance to talk with Matt. But before you do, I want to talk to you about the controversy. And there was this awkward transition in Michelle. Here's someone who emotionally is in a place wanting to address this very real feelings, emotional piece with Matt, and then she's getting jerked out of that moment and pulled into this other moment around this controversy. And so I felt that set up what would become of the rest of this episode. And that was, instead of kind of wrapping up the romantic relationship aspect of the show and then moving into a dedicated conversation about the controversy, they tried to kind of thread the needle with two strings and talk about both in tandem. And I don't personally feel that was the best way to go, because it really seemed very just hard. It seemed hard for the people involved in those relationships to try to do both. And so I don't know what the solution would have been, but I know it was a very hard episode to watch as a viewer, a longtime viewer of the show, because of the way it was kind of addressed. It felt very clunky, and like potentially some opportunity was being lost in terms of the depth and fruitfulness of the larger conversation around the controversy. So Michelle shared that she was hurt by the controversy, by the photos, that she had reached out to Rachel, who she'd become friends with, but that Rachel had not responded, and so she was bothered by that. And she then sits there as Matt is brought out, and they see each other for the first time since the end of the show. And so they do hug, and Matt sits down, and he, like most bachelors in this position, looks very nervous, and Michelle starts to tell him about how she's feeling and how he hurt her and how all she wanted was a couple of minutes and he said no. And Matt at this point has he responds with something that has become kind of an inside joke with several of the women that he dated on the show around his ability to always make you feel like you're being heard, because he says these things like, I'm very sorry that you felt that way, and tries to kind of be with you in that moment. But I started to kind of wonder if that was, really where he was at, because of the way he kind of was struggling to just get real honest with Michelle during their last date. And so he apologizes to her for what he did, acknowledges that he could have handled that moment better. And they wish each other the mutual best. And so that was great. And so she kind of gives him a soft ribbing on the way out the door kind of thing, and actually pokes fun at him for things like kissing with his eyes open, which they talked about in a previous episode, as well as some of those kind of those one-liner kind of things that he says that sometimes may seem disingenuous kind of thing, which I thought was really interesting, given I was having that same thought in real time. But and then she leaves the stage, and Matt leaves as well. And when we come back from break, Michelle leaves the stage. Matt stays because he goes into a conversation with Emmanuel about this larger controversy and the state of his relationship with Rachel. This conversation is fascinating. I highly recommend checking it out because Emmanuel, again, he really tries to ask questions of individuals to prompt deeper reflection. I never get a sense watching him that he's trying to, I gotcha, or trying to steer a conversation or a thought in a certain direction, but more trying to create that space for deep, honest reflection. And I felt him doing that, experienced him doing that with Matt, and it was hard. Matt was struggling through the conversation, and he's being asked questions like, how was the pressure on you being the first Black Bachelor after 25 seasons of the franchise? What is that like? Did that impact how you went through the season, the way you acted? All of these kinds of things, and Matt was sharing from his perspective how that impacted him. And it was a really, really, really good conversation. And so we're leading to this kind of larger piece where now Emmanuel is once again trying to thread that needle and find out what's going on now with Matt and Rachel. And it's in this moment that Matt shares that he and Rachel are no longer together. And so Emmanuel kind of continues to ask questions around, well, why? And Matt shares that there's this work that she needs to do on her own, and that he didn't feel that she could understand where he comes from and who he is truly as a Black man in America. And Emmanuel continues to kind of ask these questions to create this space for Matt to continue to dig even deeper. in his reflection, and eventually he kind of pauses that because they're going to bring Rachel out to the conversation. And so Rachel comes out, and there's this kind of awkward moment. Matt's left the stage for a minute, and Rachel's coming out, and Emmanuel begins to ask her similar questions, and she's answering the questions, and it's things like, what have you been doing? You said you were working on educating yourself. What have you been doing, kind of thing, and those kinds of questions to get her, again, reflect deeply, have just an honest conversation around this race controversy that she's embroiled in. And she's doing pretty well. There were a few questions or answers that she gave that I was like, I feel like someone coached you a little bit, I feel like sometimes she might have been, trying not to get too deep for whatever reason in her answers. But overall, I thought, it had to be very challenging for anyone involved to sit and have this moment on live television. And so I appreciated, that Emmanuel was working with them to kind of talk this through. And so Rachel stays on the couch. Matt comes back out, and they have this very awkward kind of meeting. And you can tell in the body language of Matt just how uncomfortable he is. I would say borderline angry, in terms of just really disappointed, because this is someone that he loved, that he saw as being his person, that he was working on this relationship with, and now all of this has happened, and they're no longer together, and I have to imagine that that's got to be very frustrating for him, given everything we saw throughout the season with him kind of working through his commitment challenges and such. And so Rachel is really kind of loving toward him, reaching out, touching him on the shoulder, trying to hold his hand, and he's reciprocating, but as Emmanuel's asking questions, he's struggling to answer. And Emmanuel's asking things like, is there hope? Like, is there any chance that you guys can reconcile this relationship? And Matt's not able to answer. Rachel appears to be open to it, but Matt, is just, he's going, you can tell by the body language that he is going through so much in this moment, and there's so many things going through his mind, and for whatever reason, he's not saying it. And this is unusual because Matt has been very eloquent and very thoughtful in speaking, even when he's struggling a little bit to get to the larger point. He's always spoke, and so this is kind of an odd thing to watch, him not kind of bring his voice forward. And so Emmanuel kind of wraps up the conversation, and they say their final, for all intents and purposes, goodbye, Rachel and Matt, and Emmanuel then is left with the Herculean task of having to go from this very heavy, very necessary conversation about race and this larger controversy to, and now we're going to talk about moving forward. So it was a very, very interesting 45 minutes to watch. I was left feeling a lot of feels, different feels, and I recommend checking it out. It was, if for no other reason, Emmanuel Ochoa is just a master at leading conversations or facilitating, I think is the better word, conversations like that. I'm going to take a break. It will be my final break of the show. When we come back, I'm going to talk about where Bachelor goes after this. What's next for the franchise this year, and I will reveal the new Bachelorette. So come on back for that. And then we are going to also do my segment, Things I Learned About TV This Week. So stay tuned.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the GSMC Television Podcast with your host, Chad. When we left for break, I was just talking about the Herculean task that the host of After the Final Rose, Emmanuel Acho, had as he transitioned from this very heavy conversation around relationship and race to the tradition of announcing the upcoming Bachelorette for the next season. He did really good. I mean, Emmanuel Acho has hosted shows for ESPN and Fox Sports 1, and so definitely he's got that kind of vibe and bone in his body to be able to host a show. And so he made as good a transition as any, given the circumstances. And, Bachelor Nation got surprised this time around. And instead of doing the traditional Bachelorette in the fall, they're actually going to do 2 seasons of The Bachelorette this year. Couple reasons for that. So reason number one is Bachelor is kind of a year-long franchise. You have The Bachelor in the winter, and then you have Bachelor in Paradise in the summer, which is their kind of summer series where they go to a resort in Mexico and people try to find love in a slightly longer time frame of I think it's 10 weeks. Instead of the 8 weeks that they're doing it on the regular show. And then in the fall, you have The Bachelorette. Well, because of COVID, they're having some challenges with getting production going on Bachelor in Paradise. The Bachelor and The Bachelorette's much easier for them because they can bring everyone in at the same time. They can get them all in the bubble, as they call it, much like basketball, get them quarantined and tested and do the show safely that way. Whereas the structure of Bachelor in Paradise, people come every week, which makes it a little bit harder to manage this bubble. And so Bachelor in Paradise was canceled during 2020, and as of right now, it's not slated to happen during 2021, although there are rumors that they are working very hard to try to figure it out. So they've selected 2 different bachelorettes. They're going to have a summer bachelorette that will air sometime June, July, most likely, and then they will have the traditional fall show. And so they chose 2 different bachelorettes. Now, typically the Bachelorette is from the previous season of The Bachelor or a previous season of The Bachelor. It's someone usually who is a fan favorite. So for the summer season, they picked Katie Thurston. Katie was one of the contestants on Matt James's season who really stood out in terms of how, because of how she interacted with the other women in the house. The fact that she was very aware of the impact that things that people say can have on people's lives post-Bachelor. And so she really tried to work with the other women in the house to not, gossip. And she was very open when there was things being said that could have caused larger problems for people, that she was bringing that forward. And she was a popular contestant. And so she's going to be the summer Bachelorette. She also kind of made a splash for being very sex positive, which, always great, especially on a show like Bachelor. So she's the summer Bachelorette, and then for the fall, they have picked Michelle Young. So Michelle Young was the runner-up in Matt James's season of The Bachelor. She is my personal favorite. 27-year-old teacher from Minnesota. Love Michelle. She will now be the Bachelorette in the fall. Michelle Young will be the third Bachelorette of color in the franchise history. So that's super exciting. And I'm just really looking forward to seeing her kind of go through her journey to find love. So that's what's next. You better believe when Bachelor starts airing, I will be covering it because I love The Bachelor. So stay tuned for that. Yeah. All right. So I wanted to end today with a segment I'm starting called Things I Learned About TV This Week. And the reason I want to do this, I love random facts. I don't know why, but I just, for whatever reason, I read about it or I hear about something and it just gets locked into my brain. And then at random moments, it comes out again. And so I recently read a Vice News article that was entitled Why Channel 37 Doesn't Exist and What It Has to Do with Aliens. And of course, I was like, I saw the headline. Of course, I'm clicking on it. Like, why wouldn't you? And so I read through this article and I was like, okay, this is really interesting. I feel like I should share. So basically, the article focused around Channel 37, which played only static for much of the 20th century. And apparently, in 1952, the U.S. Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, opened up TV systems to use UHF, or ultra-high frequency signals. And this basically... The result of that action was it increased the total number of stations that were available on televisions at the time from 108 to 2,051. So a pretty significant change in the number of stations available at a time when TV was just kind of starting to grow. Cable TV was starting to grow in popularity. And at the same time, there was this 400-foot wide radio telescope in Dansville, Illinois, that was under construction. And it operated along the 610 megahertz frequency. Now, the 610 megahertz frequency apparently is hugely important to astronomers, especially at that time. And the researchers at the University of Illinois were using this telescope like 16 to 18 hours a day. The reason the telescope was built is to study a source of static that a radio engineer had stumbled on. It was a radio engineer and an employee from Bell Labs stumbled on it in 1931, this radio signal, and they were trying to figure out like where it came from because it was interfering with radio waves, and so that's how they caught it. And what they ended up finding with the use of this radio telescope in Danville, Illinois, is that the source was actually extraterrestrial and located somewhere at the center of the Milky Way galaxy. So they needed to kind of continue to study this, and 600 megahertz apparently is commonly used for scientific research because of its placement in the band in relation to two other frequencies that are important to radio astronomy, the 410 megahertz frequency and the 1.4 gigahertz frequency. So if you kind of think of it like a bay window, there's 3 panels in the bay window. Basically, when you do a survey at those 3 frequencies, it kind of creates this picture, this bay window. So if you do away with the 610 megahertz frequency, it would be like looking through a bay window that has part of it blacked out. So you don't get a complete picture. So this telescope was really important. So the reason this was a problem, the fact that the FCC opened up the frequencies and added all these channels, was because that bandwidth fell right where channel 37 would have fallen. And at the time, television was becoming more popular, especially in major cities, and there were several major cities within 600-mile radius of Danville, Illinois, and the telescope that wanted to put channels on that frequency, that 610 megahertz frequency. And that threatened the ability for scientists to be able to use the telescope. In total, at that time, there were 18 stations that had been granted access to Channel 37. Many of those stations that had gotten the access from the FCC to use Channel 37 at that time were located in major cities like Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, Missouri, Washington, D.C. They all fall kind of in this 600-mile radius. And I keep mentioning the 600-mile radius because apparently when you're within that 600-mile radius, that's where broadcasting on that frequency really interferes with the telescope. So this problem just kind of continued to simmer under the surface as more stations applied to use Channel 37, and the scientists continued to kind of push to not have them do that. And in 1959, the International Telecommunications Union met to set aside a series of frequencies that were critical to science. And one of those frequencies was Channel 37's 610 megahertz. So the University of Illinois took that to the FCC, and in 1960, it asked for exclusive access to Channel 37. Now, this was considered a really bold move at the time because even other scientists felt that that was like a really big ask, to ask for exclusivity, given what was happening with television at that time. And so the FCC basically told them no. They felt like there weren't enough stations in that radius that were operating on that channel to really cause a problem for them. And so they said, look, we're not going to grant you that. Let's give it a couple years and see kind of what happens. Well, a couple years is about what it took for them to have to come back and deal with this problem because more and more stations were asking for use, and it became more and more of a problem. And so the scientists did the only thing they could think of. They took their problem public, all the way to the front page of the New York Times. And so under immense pressure from the scientific community, the FCC looked to make a compromise with science. And so their compromise was that no stations within a 600-mile radius of Danville could use Channel 37 until 1968. To give one specific scientist who was doing a survey of stars at the time, George C. McVitie, time to finish the survey he was in the middle of. And then the other part of the compromise that they proposed was that no station anywhere could broadcast on Channel 37 between midnight and 7 a.m. which if you factor in all of the different time zones, would basically give the scientists a 4-hour window every night where they would have uninterrupted access to that frequency. Scientists didn't like it. They didn't like it at all. And so they kept pushing with the public. And finally, in 1963, the FCC released a letter agreeing to a 10-year moratorium on the use of Channel 37. And they encouraged Mexico and Canada to do the same. The ban that was put in place in 1963 that was supposed to last for 10 years apparently eventually became permanent. And Channel 37 remained largely unused throughout the analog era of television in most of North America, as well as other countries, with a few exceptions. Then in the year 2000, the FCC allowed Channel 37 to be used for wireless medical telemetry services, which are basically devices that track patients' vitals, like heartbeats. The FCC at that time stated that allocation was flexible enough to allow both science and medical use of that channel. So that is, in a nutshell, how Channel 37, which apparently to this day is all static on analog televisions, ties to the search for extraterrestrial life. I thought that was fascinating. So I hope you enjoyed it. I'm actually going to post the Vice News article on the GSMC Television Podcast Twitter page, so that if you'd like to read the article, I just kind of condensed it. So if you want a little bit more detail or links to some of the resources that they cited, and to get more information about the radio telescopes, you can check out that article. All right, guys, I want to thank you for joining me today as we talked about the Bachelor finale after the final rose and things I learned about television this week. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Television Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask you to please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps me out. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the social medias, we'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Television Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.